what it meant, actually, unbeknownst to us kids, is the Slovenians and the Germans didn't get along, obviously.
Okay.
And so what they were singing is, yes, yes, you are my shithead, yes, yes, you are my shithead. And then they'd say cheers in Slovenska.
Cheers.
So there's a little bit of world history right there.
There you go.
If for some reason you were still wondering why we love this guy so much, now you know for sure. This guy is hilarious. Welcome to the third and final chapter of our tour with Bubs at the Montana Beer and Brewery Museum in Polson, Montana. We'll touch on how the craft beer industry and mining worked well together, if not always healthy well, along with how PBR was actually saved by a small Montana brewery, and a lot more. Grab a beer, because it's time for the final ride down Montana's craft beer history.
These things right here look like ashtrays, don't they? Mm-hmm. They're not. They're not. They're actually, and they're rare as can be, and you can feel them here, you can feel them, how incredibly light that glass is. And the few that have survived are usually broken. But every brewery and every tavern used to give out, especially in the 30s, would give out something called Dutch lunches. And all that was a salted cheese and cold cuts and hard-boiled eggs. And so these were simply salt dishes. But the state closed them down because many men would coming off of shift, and if you worked in the mines, you couldn't hardly help it. You'd end up with some kind of respiratory problems. Mm-hmm. Many men died of miners' consumption, of breathing that silicosis. They'd get breathing that dust. Okay. And my great-grandfather was one of them. He was only 59. Prohibition, if you'll recall, sent him underground to work in the mines. And he basically choked to death, as did so many of them. So Montana guys would come off and they're eating, spitting on the floor, dipping, coughing, and they were a real health hazard. And if I could grab one of these, this also was eliminated by the state for being unhealthy. Do you know what these are?
I mean, I'd say it looks kind of like a tongue depressor. Yeah.
Yes, it does. But these were, in fact, foam scrapers. And so when you came off shift and you wanted to drink some beer, you were hot, you came off, you drank your tankard of beer, you ordered another one, and they would tap the beer, the foam, and throw it on the floor like that.
Yeah.
Finish tapping off the rest of your beer, give you a full measure, throw it on the floor, and in the meantime, the next guy is doing coughing and dipping his cold cuts. And these things were really bad news because everybody was exchanging all of those bad respiratory diseases. So they got rid of foam scrapers. I love them. I think they were just the coolest thing. Now this piece is, again, one of my favorites.
You have all kinds of favorites.
I do.
Of course.
I do.
I don't blame you at all.
Well, this one is when you go into a Montana tavern or a Montana brewery, there are two things always present. Sticky, sweet floors, sometimes so sticky they'll pull your sneakers right off your feet, and that's from spilled beer. But there's also flies, squadrons of flies. And so if you're in a tavern and you're drinking your Highlander beer, put it down, drop that over, and it keeps the flies out. And it's made from real heavy cardboard, so it keeps your beer cold too. Isn't that terrific?
The original koozie.
The original koozie. Yeah. I love both of these pieces. Now, one thing that and I'll try to be a little more brief, but one thing that if you can reach over and grab that big bottle right there. And it's obviously a Pabst from Milwaukee, but if you look up on that top row up there, that's the Kalispell Malting and Brewing Company. And one of the early owners, you see that blue one that says Best Beer? Mm-hmm. Well, Christian Best was one of the early brewers, the owner of the Kalispell Malting and Brewing Company. married to a Montana girl. His brother, Lewis, was one of the part owners of a brewery in Butte, and their uncle's brewery was suffering, and he was a brewer in Milwaukee. His name was Captain Pabst, and he had married one of the best boys' aunties, and so he was writing back and forth to these Pabst boys these best boys that were brewing here in Montana. Please come home and save my brewery. I'm just getting worn out, and we're way behind. So they did, and they went back to Milwaukee, and they saved the brewery in the most unique way. And what they had discovered from brewing out here was that, of course, a lot of states have bottle taxes. And when they have the bottle taxes, every time a bottle of beer, in the 1800s, every time a bottle of beer passes a state line, you have to pay that state a tax. And they drive, or you go across the next state line, got to pay another tax. But not all states had that. But since Pabst was an exporter, they were caught doing that all the time. Had to pay that bottle tax. So these boys went back and they took the big rail cars that they would ship all the bottles of beer, and they built these big, they're called hogsheads, these enormous barrels, the whole size of the freight car, and they'd filled the beer into those hogsheads. And then it would take them across those state lines, but they weren't bottles, and so they didn't have to pay taxes. And they would bring them all the way, if it was coming across the Northwest, they would bring them all the way to little tiny Troy, Montana.
Wow.
And this guy, Fred Papineau, had a big bottling plant in Troy, right by the Idaho border.
Yeah.
And he would bottle all the Pabst beer and sell it. It all went to Idaho, Washington, Oregon, and Northern California, and it was all bottled right there in
Right
Little
there in
Troy.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's a tiny little town.
Yeah, so when you look at a PBR, after a hockey game, we always drink PBR, and I'm still playing hockey at my old age,
Yeah.
but in the locker room, you're having a PBR, and you look, and the corporate logo of the Pabst has a B in the middle of it for the best boys, the best family.
So they've kept that all this time.
All this time, and you can win free beers betting that against your friends.
Oh, yeah, right?
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
probably a very little known fact.
Yeah, but not anymore.
Yeah.
You guys
Yeah,
know
now
it.
we're gonna
Yeah.
Spill the beans.
Well, just a few more things. You can look and see how society was changing by just looking at the bottles and cans. And again, oldest always on the left and chronologic. And it's the same with, you can look up and see how mores have changed by the advertising. And it speaks to the whole nation. You can see, like these Kessler girls, these are three-month calendars, and they have good pieces of history in every one of them, but they have cute girls and in very very open poses, and a saucy little go with there. But in fact, they would give these out for people's kitchens. Hang this up hang this up in the kitchen. But again, speaking to how things were changing, you can look up here at that Lorelei. That's 1892. That's an original Lorelei lithograph. And on the back, Nicholas Kessler's son has written a poem, the poem of Lorelei, which used to supposedly brought the sailors in the Rhine who lost track of their senses as they looked up at her plain or leer, and they crashed into the rocks and were lost.
Oh, my God.
And so that story is written on the back by his son. It's one of my favorites. Again, these girls here again will show you how things have changed, but just as much as the cans and bottles, We can look here, let's see. Well, here's one right here. During the war years, every time you drank it, there were no cans in the war years except for the military. But, every bottle of beer said support the war effort, buy war bonds and stamps. So they're very, very patriotic in a lot of different ways. Right before the war, when they started canning beer in 1933, this is a Highlander from Missoula, and it is real heavy steel. They were called cone tops because the major breweries could have flat top cans. It's very expensive, the canning lines, but these could be canned in a smaller brewery's bottling line. That's why they had cones on them.
Okay.
So they turned them into something that would pass through the line, and they could still fill them up. Obviously, they hadn't invented litter yet, and right on it says, "Open like a bottle, drink from it if you wish. When empty, throw it away." And my dad was a prolific thrower-awayer.
Yeah.
Oh, he could hit a mailbox or a tree, just flipping his cans over the car.
Yeah. That's something that's definitely changed over time.
Well, it certainly has. You can also look changing over time. These were the breweries in Great Falls up until Prohibition, and after Prohibition, for a very short time, matter of weeks, these two breweries came together and became the Great Falls Breweries Inc. And you can see the beer they were brewing. It was Bohemian style lager beer. But Hitler was rattling swords in Central Europe at the time, and Western Europe, and so the breweries started distancing themselves from anything that said German or Bavarian, and so they went with this for just a real short time, and then they switched here to Great Falls beer, real small Bohemian style. And that was in direct response to what was happening in Europe, and eventually they dropped it all together, and it just became Great Falls beer. It's the flavor, and so it was Great Falls Select beer, and that lasted up into the early 70s. And so again, you can see how things have changed. Now you'll see. Some of these bottles, well, this one right here works. Some of these bottles have a 6 on them. And there was a fellow by the name of Emil Six that owned 13 breweries in the Northwest, many of them in Canada, but in the States he owned Rainier, he owned Salem, but he put a number 6 on anything he owned. And then in the middle there's a little banner that tells you how to pronounce his name, so it was called Six Beer, not Sick Beer. And he here in Montana, we had Highlander was owned by him, as was Great Falls. We owned both breweries. He competed against himself. So Christmas always celebrated. In the different places of Montana, we have Yellowstone National Park, Glacier National Park, ABC, always brewed carefully. So the neck ringers told the story. There's a glacier right there. So again, it was appealing to the tourist trade and the Montana boys and girls that were drinking their beer. For me, I want people to be able to touch and feel and experience brewing history with their hands in their eyes, and so there are thousands and thousands of old beer ads, Montana beer ads, back to the 1860s, and so you can open up and you can learn about. You can learn that in Butte. Beer was advertised as Gentiles and Mormons drink our beer. That was one of their big ads. you could talk about or learn about a social tete-a-tete. If you were going to have a date and you had a hard time coming up with the right words, you could drink a couple of Great Falls beers, and hey, you were glib and fluent.
Liquid courage.
Liquid courage. And they, I mentioned earlier that the Silver Spray beer in Phillipsburg was enriched with radium. There's the ad right there.
Radium and beer. That's amazing.
Yeah.
Brewmaster at Kroger's Brewery. That's
But
amazing.
as you can see, they touted beer as being healthful, a liquid food, and whatever brewery you choose, there's a Silver Spray one right there. They also, a lot of people immediately have a strong feeling when they see a swastika, but in fact that was a sign of good luck for years and years, and cultures. So these guys had the swastika mining company.
Oh, geez.
Right there. They brewed beer, and these are their stock certificates. They brewed beer and drew swastikas around town.
Oh my gosh.
But
Nowadays you're just, what?
can you imagine? Well, there's one
the
right
swastika mines.
there. Yeah. But it had a whole different meaning.
It did.
Right.
Yeah. So again, people can come in here, sit down, spend as much time as they want. I got two binders, all of 1892 and all of 1894, and because we had so many immigrants working in the mines here, in Montana we had our own ethnic newspapers, and they were always about 2 months behind. But you could get a Montana Stadtzeitung, the Montana State newspaper, and they were full of news from your province back home.
Oh, wow.
And so it was in your own language, your home language, but they were full of beer advertisements. There's a Kessler one right here. Isn't that cool?
Well, and that ties into something else that you have explained to me before about how many breweries there were here at one time, like just in Butte, Montana. I think that's the area we were talking about specifically
Yep.
in time, and you said there were, I believe you said 30 to 40 breweries or something
39.
back in the early 1900s.
39.
39, and that was, again, had to do with all the immigrants that were working here, right?
Exactly. The Norwegians all had their own, the Irish obviously had their own, but look at these ads. I mean, that's dull in Deutschland. But aren't those the coolest things? 1894, full page. And this brewery building was just torn down a handful of years ago. If you're familiar with Helena, it's where the city library is. That was built right on the ruins of this huge brewery. Again, I just love this stuff. But you can sit and learn history as it was happening. And that's the same with all this research stuff. Now, if you were starting a town in Montana, and you were going to develop the real estate, you did pamphlets, lots of these kind of pamphlets like these. But one of the main things you wanted to have people look at was the fact that your town is going to be stable. So come here and invest in our towns. And in doing so, one of the things they always wanted was a brewery, because a brewery said it's going to be a stable town. So that was really important.
Do you know, was that a very specific thing to this area in Montana, or was it a nationwide thing?
It was
at that
nationwide.
time?
It was nationwide. Yep. But how wonderful was that a way for leaving history for us now, is to be able to look back and see those breweries. Again, we talked about ladies when men went off to war. Well, this was also eventually adapted to be something that ladies, and I have the old advertisements for this, but if you can see, it says Kalispell Malting and Brewing. Remember, best bottled beer. We talked about the Best family. And it has phone number 24, which also said, boy, this is a permanent place. We have a telephone here. But these were made for, because all the men smoke cigars in the taverns and the saloons, and yet the breweries are saying we're missing half the population here. We got to get ladies drinking beer, and they had advertisements that it's good for suckling mothers, builds up the system,
Right.
lifts up the rundown. So what they did is they were using these in the breweries for cigars. Then they started giving these out. If you bought a case of Kalispell beer, you got one of these so you could clean your house the modern way. And one of the pictures, a lady all bent over, sweeping the floor with a hand, holding these by the hand, and then a lady really finely dressed, standing, sweeping in the house into those. And so it brought on a whole bunch of new possibilities for in the home use, and ladies drinking beer. But that's kind of in a nutshell what we're talking about. Real Montana history, because the early brewers had to be politicians as well, just to be able to fend off the people that were always pushing the drives, pushing prohibition. And so
even now, a lot of brewers are
totally
fighting
incomplete.
that same battle.
Totally
in
incompletely.
different things like
Yep.
you spoke about some of the arcane laws that we
Yep.
have, not just in Montana but other states as well and across the country.
Exactly. So that's what they were doing. They were trying to enact some laws that could help save their industry, and they were all in it together. So it was an important way of doing just that.
The difference between the growler. So if we're like walking out with a growler in the, the what, 1900s.
Right up to about 1919.
Okay, what kind of growler am I getting?
If you were walking out with the growler, you would be walking out with this, which would be very rare, because I don't know if I mentioned or not, but in a brewery, the most important guy was the brewer. The second most important guy was called the copper, because almost everything in a brewery was copper in the old days, and all the pipes, all the cooking vessels, everything was copper. So the copper, or the head plumber in the brewery, would, when you first came on the job, he would watch you until he felt that you had learned enough to earn your own growler, and this is it.
So you had to earn it.
Original growler.
You had to earn your, and it was bestowed upon you by the copper in the brewery, and they ran anywhere from, he made them for you, and they were made by the copper, and given to you by the copper, and they held anywhere from 12 to usually around 24 ounces. Most of them generally were around 16 to 18, but by union contract, and I have a bunch in the research area, if you worked a 10-hour shift, then 10 times during the course of a work day, you could go and fill your growler.
10 times?
10 times, yeah. And by union contract. And you could, everybody in the state, every brewer in the state, every employee got to go 5 times at the exact same time around the state. The other 5 times were assigned by the brewery, so they didn't shut down 10 times during the course that we went and sat down. So the other breweries could adjust the other 5 times. But what's amazing to me is, one, that was in a union contract. That's how important it was. But like I said, the boys here from time to time will drink beer if it's really hot, and we're pulling a lot of prints. But if you look closely, you'll see when the copper put this together, it's put together with lead solder. And so 10 times a day, you could fill your beer and drink your beer in your lead all at the same time. So
Perfect.
Perfect. So they talk about nutty as a hatter. You know, well, as a brewer, you're just as nutty.
Oh my
But
gosh.
but these were always passed down from in family members, and they're really rare and hard to get. Technically, a growler is something that you can carry beer home in a utilitarian fashion, and that was adapted. These stayed in the brewery, but in the mining towns, you could have the inside. Your wife would send you home or to work with a little lunch bucket. They were always, or mostly, they were round, coated with lard, and then at the end of the day, you could walk on your way home, and you could get a lunch bucket full of beer to take home. And they started calling those growlers too, but this is a real growler right here. I have a couple of old notes that came from breweries that say, "Send the kid home with a bucket of beer," and that was the lunch bucket that they were talking about.
So that's kind of the transition of how we got to today's modern growler, which is basically a glass jug, or some of the now fancy ones that people have made some really cool insulated.
And in the old advertisements, these were called jugs of beer. Now you guys probably don't remember, but I certainly do. My grandparents, when I was a little kid, had an ice box. And they're really neat. They were made out of wood and before refrigerators, and they would bring around the ice, the blocks of ice. Well, this is a really rare piece right here. It has a convex bottom, and it on the back here it has this little latch, and that's the female latch. And when you had a wooden ice box in your house, you would get a little hook, and you would screw that into the back of your ice box. You would take this to the brewery. It's dated 1934, and you would at the brewery they would pull the bung off here, the cap, and fill it with beer, 3.78 gallons, and everybody had a pump to pump up their car tires and their bicycles. So you'd hand pump air into it, and hung it in the back of your ice box. And when you wanted a cold beer at home, that's what you did. They brought something like this back in the '60s.
The original kegerator.
The original kegerator. And I ran into this one, Gallatin Brewing Company. It was Old Faithful beer, 1934, and very few of these things exist. Often we think of families that are brewing families, and how one brewing family can belong to another brewing family. Well, the way they did that was their kids married each other, and this is an 1887 marriage certificate. It's in German, and it's two Montana brewing families that the daughter married the son of another brewery. And so they came together they were competitors, but they came together real close. And isn't that beautiful? It's in Latin. This is a great piece right here. My aunt was a prolific smoker and stealer of ashtrays, and so this brewery started giving these out for free. It says, "I swiped this from Montana Beer Parlor, Vote Beer," and it's cardboard, which is really crazy, with a little
That's
bit of tin over it. Yeah,
Oh.
and you can. I've only seen a few of them ever, and they're always burnt out in the middle. But there it is.
Yeah, cardboard.
Cardboard.
It's pretty amazing.
Flip it over, and you'll see it's just plain old cardboard.
Yeah,
Yeah. Isn't that wild?
it's crazy the things that people have done over the years.
Yeah, and I don't know if you have any religious affiliations. I was born into a big Catholic family. And again, I mentioned Friday confession, where everything was suddenly good again. When laws in Montana said you couldn't gamble anymore, these good Catholics said, well, what about playing bingo? We play bingo in the basement of the church. Oh, that's all right. And so,
That's okay.
So the breweries started sponsoring bingo cards.
Nice.
Isn't that great? Oh,
Smart.
Yeah.
Very ingenuitive.
I think so too.
At the end of the day, beer, we always talk about beer being about the people and community and that whole thing. And this is still that same thing. You're talking about beer families marrying into each other,
That's right.
breweries helping each other throughout history. And
Well, when I was in Slovenia, the word for cheers is na zdravje, and so when we were kids, we'd say, ja, du bist mein Scheißkopf, ja, du bist mein Scheißkopf, ja, du bist mein Scheißkopf, du bist mein, ja, na zdravje.
na zdravie.
What it meant, actually, unbeknownst to us kids, is the Slovenians and the Germans didn't get along, obviously.
Okay.
And so what they were singing is, yes, yes, you are my shithead, yes, yes, you are my shithead. And then they'd say cheers in Slovenska. So there's a little bit of world history right there.
There you go.
Good. Cheers to my shithead.
That was it. Thank you, guys. I'm honored that you came.
To hear more of Bubs' personal story, head on over to our podcast, the Craft Beer Travel and Adventure Podcast. You can find it on our site at livingastoutlife.com or anywhere you listen to podcasts.